Season 3, Episode 7.
Sometimes it's the first time that they have seen or experienced the service that they're providing. It's a bit like a chef basically cooking a meal having never tasted it.
This is UX Podcast. I'm James Roy Lawson.
And I'm Per Axbom.
And we are two humans here to help you push the boundaries of how user experience is perceived and boost your confidence in the work you do. We're based in Stockholm, Sweden, and you're listening to us all over the world, from France to South Africa.
Lou Downe is the author of Good Services, the best-selling book on how to design services that work, and the founding director of the School of Good Services.
Lou is the former Director of Design for the UK government, known to many of us as GDS. There, they founded the discipline of service design, eventually growing a 2,000-strong team of designers and turned it into one of the largest and most influential design teams in the UK.
We sat down with Lou just a few hours before they were about to present the talk, Bad Services, Why Services Fail and What We Can Do to Make Them Work, at From Business to Buttons here in Stockholm. And we discussed the challenges we face with designing services.
Lou, where is service design going wrong? Or maybe I could even ask, are we actually doing service design now?
That is a really good question, and I see why you were smiling when you read that question. So, I don't. Firstly, I will caveat my answer with I think there are a lot of really difficult conditions to service design right now that mean that to a lot of extent, I don't think we are designing services. A lot of the work of service design at the moment is strategic design. It's kind of pushing back from UX design. It's organizational design. It's new product development. But what I don't see a lot of is fundamentally changing a pre-existing service and then asking the really big question of actually what do people need? What are we trying to achieve? And then what should the service actually be? And then totally changing the whole thing. That is what I don't see a lot of. And I think partly it's just the type of organizations that we're in at the moment and the way that the economy is. You know, when organizations have less money, they become way more short-sighted about their decision-making. I think the position of design, you know, we've been trying to get in boardrooms and around the table for years. Decades, you know, probably hundreds of years, to be honest. And I'll be really honest, I don't think necessarily that things have changed all that much. I think we're starting to see more senior design roles, but are they listened to? You know, you may be director of design, you may be head of customer experience. Do you have budget? Do you have as much control and power as people who are delivering operational services? I think it's still seen very much as the internet will be done once and then it will go away. And then, you know, perhaps maybe we won't need our designers or our user researchers or our digital teams. And that's still very much the mental model, I think, of a lot of organizations, that change will just stop. So it's really difficult to make a lasting impact in an organization where your job is inherently seen as a temporary transformation rather than necessarily an ongoing role.
Oh, right. Because, I mean, you, of course, were part of revolutionary work at GDS in the UK to establish service design as a role and grow that into a huge collection of service designers. I don't even know how many it got up to in the end, but it was a scary amount, I think.
It was a lot. Well, I mean, in total, the number of designers and user researchers was about 2,000, but that was across all the government departments.
Right.
So
that is a scary big number.
Well, you say that, but then there's 500,000 people in the civil service.
Exactly.
So it's a drop in the ocean.
Exactly. From perspective, it is.
Yeah.
But you'd think, I mean, because that's where we've come from, I guess, is thinking we need to have real service designers doing real service design work. And you'd think that's a box ticked. If you've got 2,000 people who are capable of doing that work, then the next step should be straightforward.
Yeah, totally. But I think there is a real glass ceiling for design, and certainly that's what I saw in government, where what I saw in my 7 years was going from, we had a lot of graphic designers, we had interaction designers, we had some people who would call themselves UX designers. We transitioned into service design, which I think inherently sometimes it can be more strategic. I'm not going to say it always is, because I don't think there is a hierarchy of design. So we saw that. We also saw an increase in the number of design leaders. So we went from, 1 or 2 heads of design in different departments to most departments then having heads of design or directors of design, which was fantastic. A lot of them were permanent members of staff as well. So there was a real investment in design and in operationalizing it. But those heads of design had the same problems as each other, and that was that they really struggle to influence policy. Because in government, there's this 2-tier system where policy is basically what the service is and to some extent how it works. That gets thought of and dreamt up sometimes at 4 a.m. after there's been a ministerial announcement because of something in the Daily Mail. It gets chucked over the fence to the design teams and the digital teams, and they then have 6 months, 12 months, 2 years to deliver that thing. And sometimes you can make real inroads in changing that stuff, but it is a real glass ceiling. So that was what we were really struggling with. I think there are elements of other countries and to some extent the UK as well that are starting to break that down. But like I said, the fact that we have had, 14 years of enforced austerity, has really forced organisations to become really panicked. And when you're panicked, you don't think long term. And you're not inclined to reinvent really radical policies, especially when, being a little bit political for a second, because we just had our election announced in June. The role of digital in government and in a lot of organisations is seen as cost saving, not about making experiences better for users. Right. And sometimes they're in alignment and sometimes they're not. But when they're not, you don't get heard. Sorry, that's very depressing.
No, it is. But I often joke about the fact that our generation, who was we started working with the internet in the late 90s, then it's kind of our fault in that we pushed the internet so hard in the late 90s as a cost-saving thing. Move from paper to digital, you'll save money. And there's a whole generation of managers and politicians or whatever that remember that push from paper to digital. Yeah. And it's a cost-saving thing, is that it is the internet.
Yeah, and it makes sense when you think about it, right? Every single technology that's come along, and I'm sure the same was with telephony, we thought, well, hey, this is going to radically reduce the cost of this particular output, and progressively we've thought that we would need less and less people, but what's actually happened is that now we face the vast majority of people who are phoning government are phoning it not because they don't know the internet exists, but because they can't use the service that's there. So just slapping stuff on the internet doesn't make it cheaper because, and actually I was looking at this yesterday, the numbers of civil servants has not gone down. No. It's actually gone up, which is sort of ironic when you have a conservative government that's supposed to be, invested in shrinking government and saving costs. And that was the mandate for GDS, but the number of civil servants has gone up. So why is that?
And this is something you talk about. It's not enough just to move the physical thing onto the digital space. Because, people move online forms onto digital and they don't work. And they say, well, look at that. Digital doesn't work. But do people understand this concept of experience online?
No. I in answer to your question, no. No, and but I think what you're pointing to is a really important fundamental part of this, which is that I don't think, I'll rephrase that, I think there is a separation between traditional management culture and what we actually need in organizations now, right? So traditional management culture says you don't need to understand the delivery mechanism of the thing that you're providing. You don't even really need to understand what the service is or how it works. That's kind of detail for someone else. You don't want to get into the weeds. You want to delegate, people should come to you with solutions, not problems. All of these really toxic things that we were, taught in the 80s and 90s. And now what we're seeing is that's created this massive separation between leadership actually understanding what the internet is and how it works, and even to some extent what their services are. The vast, majority of people that I talk to, and that that's not an accusation to them. I understand they have a million other things to do, but it's a bit like a chef basically cooking a meal having never tasted it. That makes no sense to me, that you would be leading a service and you have never seen it before, you've never tried it, you don't really know what users have to go through. And it's that separation that I think we need to break down as designers and bring people back into contact with users on a daily basis. Because when you do, it's really hard to ignore the fact that someone can't do something, or they're struggling to use that.
And you even use the phrase service literacy. I mean, do people even understand that they have a service? Is that the case, that they simply don't understand?
Yeah, most of the time. I mean, you talk about service design, the word design is massively misunderstood, so people think you're there to, make something look better. Mm-hmm. And then you have the word service, which most of the time we think equates to a system or a process or a tool, and not actually, something that helps someone to do something, which often incorporates your bit of the service, but 20 other bits as well.
Yeah.
And that mental model of, actually, I'm delivering something which involves loads of other people, and my job is not to just command and control and just care about the thing that I have a budget line for, but actually my job is to collaborate with other people, is a totally different job. So I think it's kind of, not to bang the drum here, but I think it's time that we start rewriting the job descriptions for leadership in services, that, we do understand that collaboration, we do understand what our services actually are.
So reflecting and thinking on how traditionally, I guess, going back, businesses were very linear in their service. I mean, you had a supermarket, then it was a store people walked into, they bought stuff, they walked out of the store. I mean, this was a linear service, and now it's nowhere near linear. I mean, even if you've got your head around digital aspects of your previously physical service, that has so many service variations. Taking the supermarket example again, then some people shop online, some people still shop in the physical store, some people pay by blipping, some people pay with cash. I mean, the number of service variations just starts to spin out of control. So what I'm getting to there is, if you are in charge of a service, you might understand there's a service, but do you really understand the service variation?
Yeah. And sometimes you're right, it's so complicated that it requires you to have, not just a one-time knowledge of that level of complexity, and also, to some extent, how all of those different technologies that you're using will impact what the service needs to be and how it needs to work. But when those things change, and sometimes you're not in control of that. If you think about the number of really complex partnerships between different technology suppliers, you're not in control of any of the changes that they make. And I mean, there was a really interesting incident quite recently. We had a very suspicious coincidental outage of till points at a number of different retail places. So I think Sainsbury's was affected, Greggs was affected, I think Tesco's as well.
Yeah, big retail places.
Yeah, big retail. And of course, every single one of them was like, well, these are not connected. It's a technology issue. Anyone on the outside could easily say, well, that's one supplier who's basically running all of their till points and their payment systems, and something has gone wrong, probably because they're doing those technical changes overnight, and that's when they're processing all of their online orders. So the amount of reliance that we're now seeing in this kind of stack of delivery on other suppliers, there's no way that you can, run a service now and not understand that now, I think.
Yeah, we've seen similar weak points in these chains here in Sweden recently. Yeah. There's a tool we use for identity. Bank ID is called, and that went down for an hour or so the other week. And you can't log into any bank service. You can't confirm payments or anything for an hour. It was just like, well, we'll just wait and hope they fix it. And it's interesting from a service design perspective. I'll see it's like, how's that communicated? And it was kind of, the media were covering it quickly, the ones that were doing breaking news, that kind of stuff. But when it came to actually properly communicating the kind of, it's okay, this will be fixed in an hour, or it's okay, but it may be tomorrow. I mean, there was no real. And then when it was fixed, under the carpet. No one mentions it.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And when you start to realise that one supplier supplies, 40-50% of that market, you start to realise how vulnerable so many of our systems are on our services to, that, I guess, conglomeration of different infrastructure. There was a really interesting blog post written recently whose name I can't remember, but maybe you can put it in the show notes. And it was called Rewilding the Internet. And if you Google that, you'll be able to find it. And it was essentially about the fact that we're in a world where the infrastructure for our services is becoming increasingly owned by a smaller and smaller number of organizations. And that is creating a huge amount of vulnerability, but also a sense that we don't really have a lot of choice in how our services work. And if you think about, the effect that infrastructure has on the way that our services work in general in life, right? We're still operating cities with Roman roads. If you own the infrastructure, you own how the thing works, So that, I think, is a really, a really big area for service designers to get into, to think about how data and service infrastructure affects not just one service, but many different services and how they work, which I think is a really exciting area to move into.
I love how we were expressing that the leaders and managers also need to understand how the internet actually works. This is something we talk about a lot because we are really into the technical issues as well. But how do we get there? How do we help people understand that you need to understand the material that we're working with?
I think part of it is just by using it. I've seen a lot of problems caused by the fact that IT access is still quite locked down in a lot of organizations, and it causes that lack of technical literacy. Because if you can't access a lot of different technologies on your work computer and you're at work for 6 hours a day, it's really difficult to really not just understand those technologies, but understand the mental models of the internet, how people communicate, how you do a job in general. So I think that's one part of the issues. The other part of it, I think, is actually just being able to be brave and sort of set aside some of that shame. I speak with a lot of people who don't want to admit that they just don't really know how digital services get made. And, they're the same people who will stand up on a stage and talk about, the next digital strategy. And again, this is not in any way to criticize those people. I completely understand why they're in that situation, because you get so far and it's hard to admit and say, actually, how does that work? When you say data, what exactly do you mean? And so, we're talking about AI and how exciting that is. And that same person, ultimately is not funding the infrastructure and the data that's needed for that AI to actually work. And you go, well, clearly that strategy is not going to work. So I think part of it is about us as designers, as people within those digital teams, to create a safe space for people to ask us questions and to focus on that really basic level of understanding and literacy as well. It's a specialism, and we should explain it and get better at doing that in a simple way, I think. But yeah, it's not a
My experience is that designers really don't understand the material either, because we see all these migrations into new websites and people don't even remember to do redirects. So now 2,000 links to that website are dead. Yeah. We see that all the time. Yeah. And absolutely. It still keeps happening.
Yeah. And if you think about it, designers need to understand the materials that they're using, right? We always have done. If you were designing furniture, you needed to understand the materials of wood or metal or whatever you were using. And now we're in a world where increasingly, I think, as designers, we're struggling to understand the restrictions and the affordances of the materials that we're using, which is the internet. And that's hard. That means we're going to end up making mistakes. But I think there's a complexity to this, in that it's not just about understanding the impact on our services. And going back to that kind of collective question, there's one kind of project that sort of always sits in the back of my mind when I think about what my role would be as a designer in an organization. And it's years ago. I was working at a telco, and they wanted to create a new app that would basically allow people to buy data at different prices. So this was kind of back before people really understood what data was. They still don't understand what data is. It's really, really difficult to understand. But the leader at the time basically said, okay, well, what we want to do is we want to price different parts of the internet differently. So, your Facebook and your other social channels are 0 rated, so you can use those for free. And we're going to use this as basically an incentive for people to come to our service. And I just took one look at it and went, you know that this is breaching net neutrality, don't you? You know that this is making one part of the internet free and one part of the internet not free. And at the time, the mobile internet was not as ubiquitous as it is now, but that horse has well and truly bolted. And I'm really proud to say I said no to that project, and I kind of walked away. I had the privilege to be able to do so, which not everyone does. But those sorts of decisions are really important as designers to say, okay, well, yeah, of course it would absolutely benefit this telco to have this really, excellent incentive of free Facebook or free Instagram. But it's going to absolutely negatively impact the rest of the internet and this kind of delicate ecology that we're looking after. So I think that's really the understanding of the materials as well. It's understanding the economics of the internet that's also really important.
Right. Yeah, no, that's really interesting because, one thing is we talk about redesigning services or kind of like improving services, which is like forward, but this is kind of related to transition between existing service and next service. What are the consequences? Whether it's redirects that don't work or whether it's you're breaking the internet. I mean, it's on a different level with net neutrality. That kind of transitional design, I think, is something organisations really, really overlook.
Yeah. And managing multiple platforms at the same time, right? So every organisation will have one foot in 2024 or whatever year it is when someone's listening to this, and another foot in 1985 and, 3 other feet. Sorry, this is now an organisation with it's a centipede. But,
I wouldn't go for octopus, but you went straight to centipede.
Okay, right, yeah.
No, I think that's...
I was a civil servant for 7 years.
I was
We've
nice,
got a long history. But some government services date back to Henry VIII. We're talking 1500s when things were written on vellum. So there is this kind of difficulty that we've got of managing multiple different technologies, multiple different versions of what we thought a service would look like at a particular given moment in time. And most of our services were not designed for the internet. They were designed for a world where you didn't use that service on your own. So it was totally fine that it was really complicated and hard to understand because you didn't have to find it. You didn't have to use it yourself. And then understanding how you take that and you completely retransition that into a world where someone is using it on their own means that person has to understand not only the technology, but also the way in which someone is going to access that. And if you then start to think about a world where, and I don't want to be one of those people who's like, I'm predicting the future of the internet, which is my predicting the future of the internet voice. But I'm going to regret that later.
when we hear that voice...
Yeah, you can take that.
When we hear that voice in this talk, we're going to go, here comes the future.
Yeah, oh God. They're predicting the internet. No, but, we're facing a world where perhaps... search might not exist in the same capacity that it does now, right? So, while we're moving towards a world where, that net neutrality is broken down even further so that essentially our access to digital services, digital content is via those big walled garden platforms like Instagram and, Facebook, TikTok, WhatsApp, whatever. How on earth is someone going to find your service? How are they going to trust it when actually you're not responsible for the UI anymore because someone's accessing it, within a platform that also owns the UX for that particular service? So, it's posing real big challenges, I think, to designers, and it's ones that I think we, as always, it's no different to how it was 20 years ago. We need to get ahead of those things and to start thinking about what does our practice look like in that space. And I think we're in a world where actually our practice is increasingly about asking the really big, almost moral questions, actually, about is this the right thing to do for users? Does this equal transparency? Does this equal the type of world that we want to live in, or does it not?
I mean, do you think if you don't have service designer in your title, your role, how do you go about asking those big questions? I mean, can you?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, I don't think don't think being a service designer is like a ticket to, a door into the boardroom where, they say, well, can you ask the service designer questions now? I mean, you can do it as a product owner, you can do it as a UX designer, user researcher, anyone can ask those questions. I think it's about creating an environment where people can do that. And so most of this is about, having the bravery to ask those questions in the first place, but also finding yourself in an environment where those things are going to be listened to as well. And I think there's a sort of increasing issue that needs to be addressed about the sort of mental health of designers. A lot of the time, I think we're blaming ourselves for not being able to get stuff done or to ask the right questions or not being listened to. We feel like we need to be more confident, but really the answer is not confidence. The answer is often the organisation that we're working in is just not quite working in the right way. So, sort of parking that self-blame for a moment and looking at the organisation and going, okay, well, what conditions would I actually need in order to be able to ask these questions properly and to have them answered? Because often we're asking completely reasonable questions and we've got ourselves into a situation where we think, well, it's totally fine that no one's listening to me. Well, it's not totally fine. So, often the answer is there isn't a solution to that, but sometimes there is. And sometimes that means us, actually thinking strategically about the way in which we can change the organisation to allow more of those questions to be asked. And this is why I always think about the fact that service design is kind of 10% design, and it's about 90% creating the conditions for design to happen. Yeah. That's not the fun stuff. It's not the user journey mapping.
Well, it can be if you see the value of it. If you're patient and you.
Yeah, I mean that reward from seeing that kind of change.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing seeing a new design release somewhere, but if you've managed to make basically systemic change in an organisation, that's a big payoff.
Because then the 10% of design that you do will matter so much more.
Yeah, and it will actually happen and much faster, and it will have impact. So but it's that work is long term, and it doesn't happen overnight. And I think that's the kind of patience that we need to practice as well, of realizing that the timeline for that sort of change is way longer than the timeline for just releasing a new product or a feature or something like that.
Yeah. Still hopeful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lou.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm really fond of this phrase that Lou has, service literacy, talking about how so many of us really don't understand what a service is, and people in charge don't understand what a service is and how it works and how complicated it can be. The metaphor being a chef cooking a meal and never tasting it. I love that. I'm going to steal that and use it as well. There are so many of us now in this space who are seeing how the internet is becoming more complicated at the same time as there are fewer players. And the key word there, of course, is vulnerability. The way that things can break is rather complex, and it's very hard to control because we have built so many dependencies into everything, dependencies on tools that many different people use, but that itself could be a problem. Like the example that Lou gave with the tills, that if one software that powers many tills in many places, in many shops, goes down, that is very bad for an entire country.
I mean, yeah, we've designed bigger services, bigger systems, and bigger services and bigger systems will fall bigger and fall harder when they fall. So the vulnerabilities, we're more prone to them, I guess. And I'm just thinking back, there's so few players now. Even back in the day when in the 90s when we had the internet, the early days of it, there were so many internet service providers. There were hundreds and hundreds of them in the UK at least when I was connecting up for the first times. And many of them, they had, if you rang a number, if you rang in then, and if you rang the number and it didn't work, some of them had alternative numbers you could ring in. So they'd had inbuilt resilience into it all. There was the internet was much more resilient. Things would reroute. You could find other ways to get to somewhere.
Exactly. And those of us using the internet, we knew this. We knew that things could break, so we were ready for it. So we always had this in the back of our heads. It may not work. If this doesn't work, I'm going to go this way instead. I'll try different things. I'm ready to play around and see what works.
This connects into the economics of it, which Lou also mentioned. But Lou mentioned it from the viewpoint of austerity on organizations and funding. That, when you're an organization that's got less money available, you're forced to reduce costs. And some of the work that we do sounds very expensive. And if you're talking to management about rethinking a service or analyzing this from scratch and seeing what impact are we really trying to make, people are just going to go, whoa, I just want you to kind of tweak that bit on, that's, then we call it anyway. But think about the economics of it and the economics of the internet and big systems like we have now. We've ended up with an oligopoly situation. There's just a handful of players, like you said, that are controlling the entire internet, and
a small number of pipes as well.
Yeah, well, it's all down to kind of that's the economics of it. That it's no matter what market you're in, if you've got too few players, then it's not going to function correctly. There's going to be oddities. That can be anything from excessive profits or economic rent from things, or like we see on top of that in the internet, huge vulnerabilities in the way we have systems. It's not just the kind of profit side of things. It's also when that breaks, it breaks big. So the impacts from failing services or services that are not functioning spread deeper and further.
Yeah. So thinking about this, really, we say that, well, people just don't understand the material they're working with. People just don't understand the services that they're working with. But it is actually quite complex, and maybe it's a bit unfair to expect everyone to understand it because they're thrown into this existence where everything is just humongous. And of course it's hard to understand because you haven't been given the chance to start where it wasn't complex, where it was actually something that you could get an overview of. It was something that you could teach yourself almost.
Yeah, the life experience. Now, and now we're coming from the context of being two men in our 50s who have grown up with the internet in the 90s and 80s and 90s. But so we've got life experience, which has allowed us to experience the complexity as it becomes more complex. And a lot of people, I guess, have been born into this world as designers, and it's complicated from day one. And if I think about this, when you approach this from a service design point of view, there are many situations where you aren't going to be able to design for a situation because that situation is unthinkable, I guess. I mean, we mentioned in the mentioned in the podcast, disruptive payment systems. Bank ID was the one we talked about with Lou, which is the authentication system here in Sweden that a lot of people use. But last week, one of the mobile operators, their internet, mobile internet went down. And these kind of things, you just, when you're sketching, designing services, you're just not going to be able to say, okay, how do we design for the national internet backbone of our country going down? How do we design for when the adopted identification system for this country goes down? I mean, you're going to put it in that box of things we can't deal with.
But also, how do you get the imagination to think about those things? What I'm sort of hoping for, and that I think is like the way to manage this, is to encourage people to play around more with the internet, to get that experience of writing an HTML page maybe, or using tools like if this then that to, I don't know, an alarm goes off somewhere, there's a light that turns on somewhere else, and I can build that myself because these interfaces are quite simple in that way. I want more people to feel confident doing stuff like this because that means that they get a better understanding of how the internet works.
And I think you're right, and from the way that we're moving forward now really rapidly to use AI tools in our work, whether it's writing, coding, or designing.
Which for me is the opposite of experimenting, of course.
Yeah. So arguably there, I mean, while we're shifting towards these tools and gaining like benefits and efficiencies from using them, we probably should be at the same time boosting how much we don't use the tools.
Yeah.
So that you do actually get your hands dirty and still feel the craft of what we're doing, instead of letting everything do it for us. Autonomy is going to be the death of our knowledge.
Because understanding how crap these tools can be as well means that you need to understand why they are crap.
You've got to have the experience and the knowledge to be able to recognize the flaws and mistakes that they produce. I've just thought of a practical thing that maybe everyone could do, which I don't think people do often enough. Flight mode.
Mm-hmm.
We've just been discussing one of the obvious things of like services. Well, the infrastructure goes down, whether it's a payment system or whether it's kind of an internet connection or whatever. I mean, we've mentioned before about how it's useful to kind of test with throttled bandwidth to see how your service would be if it's on a really slow connection. But if you notice the amount of times, I mean, me and you were actually flying together the other day, so you notice when you're on an aeroplane, when you're in flight mode, how many services totally fall over and cannot cope with the fact they don't have an internet connection.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just like they go like, whoops, we don't have an internet connection, and that's it. Some of them just don't cope. They don't even let go. They kind of keep on going, trying to connect, and don't even fail with grace.
Yeah. Well, we know it's quite feasible and possible to actually display something that is useful to me.
Yeah. But I mean, you can play with that. You can see how does your service cope if you strip it away from the internet. What goes on, and maybe then you can just ask yourself how you could improve that situation. I mean, now we're moving a little bit away from like service design as a larger thing, which I think we were focusing on a bit more in the conversation. Here it's more scenario planning, I guess.
Yeah, but also But that is part of the point you were making about how services are not linear anymore. Services just are all over the place, and they are more complex because we have more touch. For every touch point, we have more touch points. So it's like a 3-dimensional rather than 1-dimensional line. I think of all these customer journey maps that we draw and how linear they always are. But for every touch point on the customer journey map, there are probably so many things that can happen there.
I mean, in some ways, this all sounds really, really exciting. There's even more complicated things to analyze, to look at, and to improve.
Yeah, I like how you approach that perspective.
But at the same time, it's a big ask for us. So I really value what Lou said about making sure we've created the space in our organizations and feeling safe to ask the big questions, and it's not just about being brave, but what conditions do we need to have around us to feel safe about talking about some of these bigger issues with our services.
And don't always be in such a hurry, because that is what makes us make mistakes. So not just space, but also time. The point that Lou made about some services date back to Henry VIII. I mean, that's a piece of wisdom there. I mean, everything builds on something older. So that means we also, besides the complexity of the here and now, there's the complexity of things being built on top of each other for a long, long time, both from a value perspective, but also from a tech perspective.
Yeah. Respect the past when building the future.
What should our listeners listen to next, James?
I think this would be a good moment in time to go all the way back to episode 193 from 2018, 7 years ago, and take the time to listen to our talk with Lena Chisnell about designing democracy.
That is a long time ago.
Yeah, and it's probably the most high-level service design chat we've had. Because, I mean, in that chat, we're not just talking about a system or a platform or a website or an app. We were talking about democracy.
Exactly. And what I do remember from that chat is exactly this, what I was just saying about customer journey maps. She was drawing this map of how a voter moves from understanding, well, how they go about it to actually going to vote, and showing that, well, this doesn't work because it's never this linear.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
See, 7 years on, Per, and you've still got some takeaways from that episode. Go back, people. Dig it out. Listen to it. It'll be in the show notes. Click.
Remember to keep moving.
See you on the other side. Where do bad rainbows go?
I don't know, James. Where do bad rainbows go?
Prism. It's a light sentence.